This is Chapter 19 Powerpoint, and we will start off by looking closer at Abraham Lincoln, and in particular, a very famous quote by Abraham Lincoln: "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." So we're getting closer and closer to Civil War. This chapter will be kind of focusing a little bit more on Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas and the events leading up to Bleeding Kansas, Kansas-Nebraska Act. And just a reminder that Chapter 19 includes images that are in the public domain. And if you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to email or give me a call. So we will begin Chapter 19 PowerPoint. In Chapter 19, we'll be looking at the question of slavery and three important themes: Uncle Tom's Cabin in particular, and Harriet Beecher Stowe's impact on the slavery debate, abolitionists, Bleeding Kansas of 1855, and then we'll also spend some time talking about the Dred Scott decision of 1857 and its implications. So we look as moral temperatures rose, prospects for a peaceful political solution to the slavery issue simply evaporated. So on the eve of the Civil War, Harriet Beecher Stowe, an author who writes a landmark book. If you ever have a chance to read it or ever interested in reading it, it's worth your time. Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a book written about, of course, you have Uncle Tom, the slave, and Simon Legree. I believe that's the main character, the slave owner. And this book, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, calls attention to the fact that in slavery, families are still torn apart and slaves are still brutally beaten. And some of these aspects of slavery, some of the northern abolitionists kind of denied, or this book definitely called attention to some of the more brutal aspects of slavery. And so it lended reason and cause to the abolitionists to no longer negotiate, no longer have compromises, but to stand firm. So this kind of brings us one step closer to the Civil War. Very, very impactful book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Kansas, of course, then comes to the forefront of the slavery debate as free soilers arrive in Kansas, courtesy of the New England Immigrant Aid Company. And because of the issue of popular sovereignty and people being able to vote in Kansas for or against slavery, abolitionists of the Northeast tried to populate the Kansas soil with free soilers, but then it also was a popular cause by Missourians to cross over, and this leads to all kinds of problems in Lawrence, and also even still today some of the rivalries between Kansas and Missouri come from this time period. We also have then the Sharps rifles that are brought to Kansas and smuggled in as Beecher's Bibles, and so you'll find a lot of this information in your textbook on page 398 and 399, even on page 400. So hopefully you spend some time reading through those pages. I wanted to call your attention to a few things that are mentioned on page 399 and 400. Page 400, some of the Nebraskals, the rascals from Nebraska, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act allowing for popular sovereignty to exist in Nebraska. And then, interestingly enough, the census of 1860, this is mentioned on page 401, I believe, 400, but that the population of Kansas is 107,000, but only 2 slaves. I think there was only 15 slaves in Nebraska. And the border ruffians from Missouri, the ones that crossed over into Kansas, and to vote early and to vote often in order to make Kansas a slave state. This Shawnee Mission, the fraudulent government, and the illegal government of Topeka, the free soilers of Lawrence. Just a whole bunch of themes here on page 398 through 400. Please spend some time looking at those. And this is a picture of the raid on Lawrence, and how some of the Missourians that came over tried to throw a printing press into the river and burn down certain buildings that were pro-abolitionist centers. And then we have the famous story of John Brown, and John Brown's brooding over the recent attack on Lawrence. He led a band of followers to the Pottawatomie Creek and literally murdered 5 surprised men presumed to be pro-slavery. And this is then a mural that is actually in the state capitol in Topeka of John Brown. And how is John Brown a hero? Is he a lawbreaker? But he is an active abolitionist, and will not compromise, and just kind of portrays the feeling of the day that no longer is compromise acceptable. Slavery must be abolished. Spend some time looking at the Lecompton Constitution and the controversy where the vote for the Constitution with slavery or with no slavery, but the Constitution would protect the owners that already had slavery, all 2 of them. Free soilers boycotted the polls. The Constitution was approved. For a while there, you had then 2 capitals in Kansas, and so bleeding Kansas and the events leading up to the Civil War, everything was focused on slavery. So again, spend some time, page 398 through 400, 401, looking at Kansas history. This is, hopefully you can understand this popular sovereignty theme, the theme of popular sovereignty versus semi-popular fraudulency, and just spend some time hopefully understanding what the vote to allow or to not allow slavery, the popular sovereignty debate, and was it a fraudulent approach to freedom. And so then we look at the entire Lecompton Constitution submitted to a popular vote, defeated by free soilers. So then we have a very interesting story here on page 401, where after this bleeding Kansas incident occurs, you have this miscarriage of popular sovereignty and the corrupt voting that existed in Kansas, the crime against Kansas. And so you have the popular abolitionist Charles Sumner, the highly educated but cold, humorless, intolerant, and egotistical Charles Sumner, and how he got on the floor of the Senate and made himself one of the most disliked men in the United States Senate, because he condemned the South as pro-slavery men, hirelings picked from the drunken spew and vomit of an uneasy civilization. And so after he gives this speech, of course, criticizing Southerners as hirelings picked from the drunken spew of an uneasy civilization, then you have Preston Brooks from South Carolina, who beats Charles Sumner within a few breaths of his life. The Free Soiler North was mightily aroused against the uncouth and cowardly bully Brooks. So look on page 401, 400, the last paragraph of 400 and on to 401, and read about this beating that occurred in the United States Senate. Then we move to the election. On the eve of the war, the election of 1856, James Buchanan, Fremont, and Millard Fillmore. And then, of course, James Buchanan, the Democrat, wins this election. But that's the election of 1856. Civil War begins after the election of 1860 when Lincoln gets elected. Now on page 403, we're going to start looking at Dred Scott case of 1857. So within 2 days of Buchanan's presidency, within 2 days of within 2 days of Buchanan's presidency, you have this case in which Dred Scott, and it's written about on page 403, but Dred Scott is this slave who has, his owner has moved to Illinois and up to Wisconsin, I believe, and so, of course, Dred Scott, when he lives in free soil territory, decides to sue for his freedom. And this page number, I believe, is wrong. But Taney, Justice Roger Taney, in the Supreme Court, delivers a crucial decision, ultimately saying that Dred Scott cannot sue for his freedom because Dred Scott is a piece of property, and property cannot sue its master. And that property, if the court was to hear the case, that the property could be moved from state to state. So the thunderstruck results of this ruling mean that there is no longer a compromise of 1820, there is no compromise of 1850, and really popular sovereignty in Kansas and Nebraska don't matter. If you have a plantation in Virginia, if you have property in Virginia or South Carolina or anywhere, according to Chief Justice Taney, if you decide to move, you can move your property with you. So the abolitionists of the North and Northeast are outraged by the Dred Scott decision, and this is going to continue to have earth-shattering ramifications leading up to the Civil War. Now in your textbook, from page 405 to about 407, the authors of your book they take some time to introduce you to the young Abraham Lincoln, and this is getting to the senatorial race, the United States Senate race from Illinois between Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, the defeated congressman from Illinois, decides to renew his political career and tries to become a senator from Illinois. And the race is in 1858, 2 years before the presidential race. So the rail splitter from Illinois is going to challenge Stephen Douglas for the United States Senate. During this race for the United States Senate, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas then have a series of 7 debates across the state, and the debates are basically focusing on popular sovereignty. And Lincoln and his oratory skills are able to put into voice and vocalize the opinions of most of the radical Northeast abolitionists. And it puts Lincoln, although he loses the Senate race in 1858 to Stephen Douglas, it puts Abraham Lincoln on the national stage, and he becomes one of the leading potential presidential candidates for the future election of 1860. Now the election of 1860 rolls around, and we have 4 candidates: Abraham Lincoln, John Bell, John Breckinridge, and then Stephen Douglas. Now, if you have 4 candidates, it's going to be very difficult to win the majority. It's for sure the majority of the popular vote, but the popular vote is irrelevant when it comes to the Constitution. To become president, you must have the majority of the Electoral College vote. And so when we look here at the popular vote, it's kind of interesting to think that Abraham Lincoln only receives 39% of the vote. There's 60% of the nation that votes against Abraham Lincoln, 60% voting against the president. So this is the popular vote. However, the popular vote is really insignificant. It's all about the electoral college vote, and when you have so many candidates splitting the votes in these states, the Northerners carry the election because the Northerners all vote for Lincoln. Then he carries their electoral votes, and so then Lincoln then wins 180, which is a clear majority. 180 is a clear majority of the electoral votes. But this proposes a very difficult presidency when you have 60% of the nation's voters voting against you. So right after the election, the road to secession is taken by South Carolina and others. And on page 412, second full paragraph on the left, on page 412, the author of your textbook tends to look at how the Southerners still had very strong political strengths, and that civil war was not necessary when you consider that the South had 5 of the Supreme Court justices, especially when you consider the recent Dred Scott decision. The Supreme Court was strongly locked in favor of the South. The North did not control either the Senate or the House. Therefore, there's very little chance of any legislation being passed that would be anti-slavery. And so the only way that you could abolish slavery if you were the North, the only constitutional way that slavery could be abolished is to pass an amendment. And in order to pass an amendment, you need 3/4 of the state. At the time of the Civil War, you had 16 states. Well, let's write this down. You had 16 states that were in the North, and you had 15 states in the South. So you have a total of 31 states, but you need 3/4 in order to pass an amendment to the Constitution. Now, if you look at the Louisiana Purchase, if you look at California and New Mexico and Arizona and the potential addition of states to the Union, this was going to increase. But it was going to take a long time for the required 3/4 to be achieved. And so slavery was not going anywhere. When Abraham Lincoln was elected, Abraham Lincoln himself was very famous for saying that he was not going to try to abolish slavery, he just wanted to contain it, keep it from spreading. I think the South was foresighted enough to believe that if slavery did not spread, then slavery would die a natural death. Therefore, if they lost numbers, if they had already one state less, and they would continue to have less states, eventually they saw the writing on the wall, and so states like South Carolina and Mississippi, North Carolina, Georgia very quickly decided to secede from the Union to preserve their rights as states. On page 413, the Crittenden Compromise is talked about kind of in a last-ditch effort, last-minute effort to maintain peace. There's a proposed Crittenden Compromise, and this would reestablish the boundaries of the Missouri Compromise, divide the territories into slave and non-slave regions. However, Lincoln refused to agree with this proposal, and so that quickly put the nation on path for war. So the next step was secession, and that will be discussed in the next chapter, Chapter 20. Very quickly, as Lincoln is inaugurated, war will begin. So Chapter 20 and 21 will focus on the Civil War. That concludes Chapter 19 PowerPoint presentation. All the images within this presentation are in the public domain. Please do not hesitate to give me a call or an email if you have any questions regarding this presentation. Thank you.